Hey, hello, Lorin Coffler.
Hi there.
And thank you so much for being on my podcast. I'm really enjoyed your book. It's just such a classic fey romantasy. I mean, you really what's not to love? You can't go wrong, right?
I'm glad you liked it.
So the first thing I want to ask is how did you get into writing? Where did your passion for literature start?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I was a very imaginative kid that read all the time, like any book I could get my hands on, and I used to write, you know, fantasy stories, sci-fi stories, mystery stories I tried to write. And once I was in high school and college, I did creative writing. It was something I was really passionate about. But then I graduated in 2008, which for anybody who's listening to this and is a lot younger than me, that was like not a great time to pursue a creative career.
Definitely not.
And so I just kind of stopped writing. I worked for many years in the legal field, and now I work in a business profession. And during COVID, I started really reading again for pleasure and enjoyment. So after a few years of that, it kind of reignited the creative spark in me to like try to write something of my own. Decided to write a book, and this was the first book that I wrote. Everything before that, the longest thing, had been short stories, and so it was kind of an interesting decision to make and a journey to go along, and then to publish it too was kind of scary but also really exciting. So I've always been a creative person. I've always been a writer, but this, I'm in my leagues, and this was the first time that I was like, no, let's actually pursue this.
Yeah, and boy, did you. One thing with Sun, Moon, and Shadow, something I noticed is the mythology is so rich. Like, it's a romantasy, but there's still like that groundwork of backstory and world building in there that,
Yeah.
sometimes romantasy can feel a little bit fluffy or like feel a little bit hollow in that regard, but I didn't get that with your story. Can you talk to me about some of the inspiration behind the mythology, particularly when it comes to Omen and that whole side of the story?
Yeah.
With his conflict with his father? Just as I was reading it, I was like, I wonder what the inspiration here is. I feel like there's so much underneath the surface. So can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so actually when I first started writing, I think it was a little bit more of like a fluffier version where I was like, well, the Fae are going to have these abilities and they'll get them from like a patron god or whatever, but I didn't feel comfortable maybe delving into like who they were and where this was coming from and how that all worked. And then as I went forward in the story, I was like, okay, no, I'm going to like name these gods and goddesses and like, give them certain powers that they're bestowing on people, things like that. Because it is like Fae courts, which I think obviously we see a lot in romantasy stories. And certain courts have like a very strong like inspiration in our real world. Like I would say the Winter Court is very much like Viking inspired. It may have something to do with the fact that when I first got to the Winter Court in Sun, Moon, and Shadow, my husband and I were rewatching the entire Vikings series.
Oh, yeah. I'm going through that series right now.
Yeah, I love it. It's so good. I think that was the second time we watched it all the way through. So certain courts like have a little bit more inspiration from real world places. Others I was kind of just, cherry picking things. The story for Omen and his father and brother and that whole backstory came out of initially when I was writing. Omen was kind of a villain just for the sake of being a villain, I realized. I think sometimes that works, but I also, around that time, I was watching a YouTuber who does like long form content, sometimes about film and television, and I was watching one of his videos, and he was talking about all these Star Wars series that actually I've not watched, but about how in order to have a good villain, you really should give them a reason for people to almost be rooting for them at times. And so I was like, well, I guess that makes sense that I want, like, obviously Omen is bad. And actually we don't meet him in this book. Originally we were going to, but then I had so much story that he got pushed to the second book. But there's not a redemption arc for him. Like, he's a bad guy. He's going to be a bad guy. But I just wanted there to be more explaining sort of why he became who he was. And I think also it lends itself to a journey for Nova, being able to see that that's something that happened to somebody. Could that happen to her as well? I just thought that was an interesting thing to explore, a little bit of nature versus nurture, I guess. And there was a quote in the book from knocks that sort of like monsters are often made, not born. And so I think it's sort of an interesting thing to think about in reading and in the real world.
Yeah, I agree with that so much. I always, when I think of villains, I like to think in terms of almost like thinking more antagonist versus villain.
Yeah.
Because villain gives you that kind of like, that Voldemort energy where it's like you just kind of broke bad for the sake of breaking bad, whereas an antagonist is just someone working against the main character's goals, and that can look like anything, and it's so much more interesting that way, I think.
To see someone that's just been pushed like too far, like pushed further beyond what most people can withstand.
Yeah. What do you think creates a villain, and does Callan have that capacity in himself? Because I notice he's sort of I don't want to call him an anti-hero, but there's like a darkness within him. You know what I mean? There's this sense of, and obviously he carries like a lot of shame, and there's a lot going on underneath the surface, but there's kind of this like wall up around him. So, he almost seems like the type who has the potential to go down a bad path if things in his life went a certain way. As the writer, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I definitely think he does carry a lot of shame, and also with Callan, it's like he's very stoic on the outside, but obviously because we get his point of view, we know that there's just like a roiling storm of emotion inside him at any given time. When I saw that question, actually what it intrigued me, because I actually, in terms of like positioning a character like kind of to be a foil for Omen's story, it's Nova in terms of how I was thinking about this story. So I hadn't even really considered that Callan might be someone that people would anticipate would go off and maybe change completely. But I think one of the differences between Nova and Callan is that even though Callan has his own issues and he likes to kind of think of himself as like an island, I think, cut off from other people to a certain extent, he's definitely had a lot more support and community in his life than Nova has. And so I think maybe that's something that like keeps him, or has kept him over time, more attached to the part of him that he knows is like, more of the hero character versus an antagonist character, because he has lived for many, many years in the Autumn Court with people he considers to be sort of family, even though they're not related. Whereas Nova really had nobody, and that was intentional. Like, that was intentional for several reasons. One of which was that, because the way the story is set up is that Callan just shows up at her house and is basically like, the glamour that's concealing you here because you're actually Fae is going to disappear, and so you just need to come with me. It was like she needs to have a situation in life where it's a little bit like, sure, I'll like drop everything and abandon the very little that I have going on here. But then also it's like she's had far fewer people, I think, tethering her to a positive view of herself, and Callan has had more of that, in my opinion.
That completely makes sense. It's really interesting, because I don't know why it didn't occur to me that, like, of course Nova would be the one going on that journey more, given just her backstory, her relationship to the antagonist, and as well as just kind of some of the inner darkness within her.
Yeah.
It feels so glaringly obvious now that you mention it, but it's funny, on my first read, I just was, I think, so hyper-focused on Callan, which, I mean...
Yeah, but I also do think it's interesting where it's like, and I told you I'm very excited about the questions that you came up with, because I feel like a lot of times people, because I market my book as a romantasy, I think originally I was like calling it fantasy romance, which these are all such interesting subjective names for things. I think it means different things to different writers and different readers. But then I had a lot of people who beta read for me being like, oh, this is such a great romantasy. And I was like, I'm going to lean into that. But I think there is a certain understanding that I think is false, but that, maybe people who don't read a lot of romantasy think that it's very fluffy, or that there can't be a lot of stuff going on under the surface. But like when I had written the book and I was kind of like coming back to it and trying to be like, what are some of the themes? Like, what are some of my underlying themes that ended up being explored here? And like the fact that like generational trauma, like, are we cursed to like repeat the things that have come before us? Like, I just think it's funny that those are some of the themes I was zeroing in on after writing the book in this genre that some people are like, oh, romantasy.
Yeah, and that only comes from people who don't read the genre, right?
Yeah.
It's like I don't think you can be a romantasy reader and think of it as all fluff. Sure, you can come across a book now and then that's maybe that way, but some of my favorite romantasies are actually, in my opinion, incredibly deep, and I don't think I would I don't think I'd get drawn into a story that was pure fluff.
Yeah.
I think I need some of those deeper themes and world building. There's only so much you can do and create if the focus is just purely on the main romance, and you can't get a series out of that. Let's talk about Nova a little bit. For Nova's question, we've been talking about her, but let's dive into that a little bit more. You know, she has a lot of abandonment issues, first with her mother and then with her father, Anders, her being an outcast in the human realm. You've touched on this a bit, but can you just talk more about her psychology? Obviously, having that background made it easier for her to leave her life in the human realm and you know, just kind of be like, fine, I'll be out of here. You want to tell me I'm Faye, but what else is going on with her psychology throughout the story that has been influenced by this background?
Yeah, so I loved the idea of her having this very well constructed wall around herself to protect herself, and that was part of sort of what I was decided to have sort of be like her core wound, I think, that's going to be a challenge in her overall just journey toward who she's supposed to become, but also with the romance, because this is obviously a fated maid story. I wouldn't say that it's insta love, because I think they definitely do go from like strangers to friends to lovers in this story, but it's like any romance where it's, you know, you have to have something that kind of makes that a little bit tenuous as well. And so I think her being able to let down her walls enough to let Callan in is like a huge thing. And a big part of setting up the challenge or the struggle of whether that would happen was giving her this painful backstory. Originally, in my first couple drafts of the book, her father had just passed away, and it was unfortunate. And then in later drafts, I decided to make it that he had taken his own life, because it was something that I think played into her psychology of feeling abandoned as it was. And then also it was this thing she felt guilty about that she carried for a really long time, and she'd never told anybody about that besides Callan. And so I felt like that was a much more powerful moment for her to really be letting him into this traumatic thing that happened and something that she felt guilty about. So I really put her through it for like, you know, convenience reasons of her being ready to just sort of take off on this adventure, but also, you know, I think writers joke about it a lot that like we put our characters through so much so that they can grow so much by the end. Yeah,
they gotta have somewhere to start, right?
Yeah. Usually not great in these types of stories.
But if they start at the bottom, there's so much room to grow.
Yeah, I can only go up from here.
Yeah. So, okay, let's look at her relationship with Callan a little bit then, because we have her abandonment issues paired with Callan's shame, both kind of lurking underneath the surface. How do these characteristics coincide to just create a perfect storm in their relationship? Because it's not smooth sailing. There's definitely instant attraction, but they do go through quite a journey in finding each other. So how do you think these two, you know, I don't know that I'd call them flaws, but these character traits, the shame and the abandonment, how do those like coincide to kind of create this rift between them that they have to work through?
I think the interaction of those two character traits sort of manifests in what a couple of readers I think have felt is a little bit miscommunication tropey, where it's just like they're both coming to the situation with their own baggage, and so they have their natural reactions that sometimes it's like you feel like they've made some ground toward like, you know, are we going to be a couple? And then their own, you know, thoughts and fears kind of rear their ugly heads, and so like, you know, sort of cast them aside again. They have to like sort of overcome like a little bit of a tiff or something like that. I think it's interesting, like when I look at it big picture, I feel like I ended up writing two very similar characters. Like I kind of joke that they're traumatized introverts, and like that's part of what like keeps them from like recognizing what's going on between them for such a long time. But I love how they have so much empathy for one another. Like they give each other so much more understanding and care and support than they give to themselves. And that's an interesting dynamic. I think I've said before that I feel like Callan really needs somebody to like remind him that he's good, like tell him that he's like a good guy. And I think Nova really needs somebody to like jump in with both feet and like just be all in with her. I think that they do that for each other. They're trying to be there for each other throughout the story, and obviously like internal and external things are trying to keep them from that. but they're very similar, but they just support each other in a great way that they don't, they treat each other in a way that they don't treat themselves, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Traumatized Introverts sounds like a band name that I would totally listen to. I would be a huge fan of Traumatized Introverts if anyone wants to take up that name. But it also, it just seems so typical to real life, I think, that it's easier to extend compassion to other people versus ourselves.
Yeah.
I think that's really common, and so I can definitely relate to both Nova and Callan in that regard.
Yeah. This is actually one thing that I really like about romantasy, or that I like about the romantasy that I write. And actually I had read a few years ago Scarlett St. Clair's Adrian and Isolde books. There's the King of Battle and Blood, Queen of Myth and Monsters, and there's a third book that's at some point going to come out that I'm very excited for. But when I was reading that book, it was all of a sudden hit me. It was like a romance, but set in this fantasy world. But it was so intriguing to me that, like, in that book, there's, he's a vampire. She ends up being kind of a shifter. But they have these real world relationship issues, where they're constantly they kind of get into fights. And it's like, this is the kind of argument that you would hear a friend telling you about over dinner that they had with their partner or something. But it just makes it really fun and interesting, I feel like, to put it in this world where people also are, interesting creatures with interesting abilities and stuff like that. So yeah, that's one thing that I enjoyed writing, is I think it's in a fantasy world, but I do feel like Callan and Nova have like a very realistic relationship, and they face realistic challenges even though they also have magical abilities, which is kind of fun.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the part that I want to be fantasy, is the magical abilities, the world building, all of that. Yeah. I don't necessarily want these kind of fake sugar-coated relationships. It's so much more interesting when there's that conflict in the story, I think. Shifting gears a little bit back to the mythology of the story, can you tell me a little bit more about the Lycan? As, they're kind of the main creature antagonist we get in the story, and I found them so cool. Like, yeah, they were just so interesting. Tell me a little bit about their creation.
So they're obviously very similar to wolves, I would say, in the real world, probably more like the dire wolves of like Game of Thrones, because obviously they're like much larger. And I was thinking about this, I was trying to think of where the idea for them came from, and I almost feel like it wasn't so much about the creature itself, but from very early on in the story and writing the story, I was interested in having it be that Nova's really kind of excited about this new journey that she's embarking on, and then like within like a snap of getting into the Fae realm, she's just immediately like thrown into the deep end and has like the fight of her life. And so there was a Lycane there that was, that creature that she encounters when she first crosses. But then it's so interesting because when I write, I do have an outline. I'm definitely more of a plotter, so I kind of know even down to scenes like how things are going to go. But when you're writing a world like this, where it's not our world, so you have a lot of freedom to do whatever you want, but then you also have a lot of details that you can fill in. Sometimes it's hard to go back and pinpoint like where in my process something came out and if it was super intentional. I think from early on too, I liked the idea of Omen being able to sort of, use creatures at will, like kind of get them to do his bidding. And so Lycane filled that, where I think without him, they would just kind of be like any sort of apex predator that just like lives in the wilderness, like hunts to eat, things like that. But he turns them into more of a weapon and is able to use them as sort of like a proxy to go after Nova. And there are other creatures that the Lycane aren't the only creatures that he does that with, but that's sort of, you're right, the big one in this book. And then in the second book, more creatures are sort of added in it's sort of like Omen has eyes all over the place, even though like you had pointed out that he's very sort of mysterious, and he, like I said, he was supposed to appear in this book, but he doesn't. So it's like a lot of what we know about him is just based on like rumor and like lore, and then you see what he's able to do with these creatures that he manages to have doing his bidding, doing his dirty work for him.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, because my next question was going to be, are we going to see more creatures in future books? And it sounds like we will, which is, I love a good spooky creature. That's like my bread and butter right there. So
yeah.
I'm very excited.
I'm a horror, like movie wise, I'm a horror fan at heart. Like I watch so many scary movies. Yeah. So
you're in good company.
Yeah, and so the second book, which it's with beta readers right now, but I've sort of promised that it's like it's darker, it's spicier, and it's more action packed than Sun, Moon, and Shadow. And so far, people have seemed to indicate that I delivered on that. And that was one thing, was like really leaning more into that darker, like spookier, more creepy aspect in the second book. And so I'm actually really proud of that.
That's very, very exciting because,
Yeah.
oh yeah, for me, the darker, the spookier, the
Yeah.
better. So awesome. I will definitely be looking forward to that then. Okay, I want to talk about Agnes a little bit because she was kind of a small character, but there was something about her that seemed so significant to me. She was seemed to be one of Nova's few, maybe only friends in the human realm. Also had some sort of reputation. She's pregnant, correct?
She's
If I'm
pregnant, yeah.
remembering. Yes, so she sort of represented what Nova did not want for her life, but she was also sort of that only influence. I'm wondering if there was a, kind of a deeper reason behind her inclusion in the story. Will she be coming back? Nova's ties with the human realm had a pretty clean cut, but I'm just wondering if it'll, without spoiling anything, if you'll circle
Yeah.
back to that at some point.
Well, Agnes was in like every iteration of the story, even if like in very early versions she was a completely different like person. Her role was very different. Like, but she's always been there. She is sort of the only thing that Nova has that's like a family in the human realm. I would say that maybe she doesn't represent what Nova doesn't want, but wait, maybe what Nova thinks is not possible for hers. Because where she is in her life, like the story opens with someone who's not so great, basically, or proposing to her, wanting to marry her, but he's kind of a terrible guy, and it wouldn't be like a loving situation if she was like forced to take that step. Agnes is like happily married, is expecting a child, and so I think that maybe more represents what Nova doesn't think she'll be able to have. And I also think, even though this is just sort of, I think, psychology a little bit for Nova, but the fact that when we meet her, Agnes is about to have, in a short time, probably have her baby and then sort of embark on this new journey in her life, I think in some ways that feels like a little bit of another abandonment to Nova, even though she's a grown woman, and she'd probably be like, oh, I can't think that way. It still probably would be hard, to have this person who's been a fixture in your life for so long set off to like have their own little family. I have a lot of readers who think about Agnes a lot, like ask, like hope that she's okay or something. As of right now, I don't plan to have Nova and Callan's story intersect with the human realm again. So, I mean, the third book is just kind of loosely outlined and planned, but this isn't really part of the arc. I think it's sort of in the same way that Agnes was about to like leave and start the next leg of her journey in her life with her family. I think this is sort of like they've sort of diverged there, where Nova's gone off to live the next leg of her journey in the Fae realm. So she's there, she's a device, but I did end up having readers being like, but what happened to her? Is she okay? I'm like, she's gonna inherit all of Nova's stuff. Like, she'll be fine. I'm sure she'll miss her, but
Okay, so Agnes has already gotten her happily ever after. We don't need to worry about her. She's
Right.
doing just fine then.
Yes, she's well cared for. Exactly.
It's interesting because it just goes to show how like even a smaller character can really leave their mark on a story. Like if I
Yeah.
wasn't the only reader who kind of flagged her and
her.
got curious about her, that's so interesting. 'Cause,
Yeah.
yeah, I really was like, but what about Agnes? Like, where is she? Is she good?
Yeah. And I think that
But that's good
sometimes,
to hear.
you have people that are in your life for like a certain time. And, that was a significant person and a significant amount of time for Nova. But like, to a certain extent, it's just her and Agnes in this house, and, sort of bad memories and ghosts lingering around. And so I think it's kind of good for both of them to like be able to take that next step into another opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, some relationships run their course and
Yeah.
that's just that. Okay, let's talk about Nox. I really, really loved Nox
Yeah.
as a character. I just thought he was wonderful.
He's one of my faves.
He's great. Yeah, very well done with Nox. So, what is it about Nox that allows him to be the normal one in the family? Because, you have Omen, I'm trying to remember the name of the other brother. It starts with an
Sable.
S. Sable. Yeah,
Yep.
Sable. Onyx, and everyone's just a mess. And
Yep.
here's Nox, just turning out like a normal dude. What separates him from the rest of his dysfunctional family that allows him to just maintain this clear head and this goodness that it seems like nobody else was able to maintain?
Yeah, so I think for Knox, it's a few things. One thing, I'm just like speaking from my own, I'm not an expert in this, but my own personal experience of like growing up in a family with certain struggles, is that a lot of times people fall into kind of these archetypes within the family. And I would say that for Knox, he kind of ended up being what's sometimes called the forgotten child. Like Sable is obviously sort of in league with his dad, being a terrible person. So I think he would be sort of like this gold that's like revered by the parent. And then Omen obviously is like what I would call like the scapegoat of the family, who sort of gets the brunt of negative attention. And obviously there's a bit of an age difference between the three brothers too. So I think in a way Knox is young enough that maybe he hasn't seen the bad things for as long. He hasn't been there for everything. I think being a forgotten child sort of is able to kind of like skirt negative attention in general, probably. And not to say that still being around that and witnessing things isn't traumatic, because definitely Knox has had to overcome things. But I think he sort of just was like left out of the situation, if that makes sense. And maybe people who've read about that kind of stuff before, it makes sense to them. But he sort of alludes to the fact that he did have a period of time where he had a lot of anger that was festering inside him, and came to a point where he realized that if he didn't do something about that, that he might end up, in the same spot that his father and brothers were in. And so some of that, I think, is that he ended up having this outlet of the arts, which I have a whole Knox and Lucan like standalone prequel or whatever that I've already partially started writing. So it explains a lot more, but he has art as an outlet for himself, I think, as something that he really enjoys and that he pursues. And then also the relationship with Lucan ends up being very healing for him, and that's something I'm excited to write in that other story. Not that that romantic relationships or other people in general can fix you, but I think it can be really healing to have someone that you can share the darkest parts of yourself with, and that continues to support you as you go through struggles. And so this is all off page right now because Knox is not the main focus of this story. He ended up being more of, I feel like I wanted him to be more of like a mentor role for Nova. Someone who kind of tries to steer her, but also is like, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not, pushing you in any direction, but trying to remind her, trying to impart some of the wisdom that he has gathered over his years of dealing with pretty heavy stuff as well. So yeah. He is one of my favorite characters, and actually he and Lucan get flagged a lot as favorite characters too.
I love them too, and it's very exciting to hear that they're going to get their own little spin-off, or that at least it's on your your radar.
Yeah.
It's sad to hear. I'm just seeing the juxtaposition again between, say, Knox and Lucan versus Omen and his significant other, how one relationship was so healing while the other one was ended up being very destructive for everyone involved. So kind of shows your point that not every romantic relationship is going to be healing, and that was obviously the case in Omen's situation, I think.
Yeah, he's the antagonist, so I had to kind of let him not really get out in the best circumstances. But I think that's true sometimes. Sometimes people aren't able to overcome the things that have occurred. So I think that's realistic too,
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just more authors putting their characters through the ringer. It's just how it goes sometimes, I guess.
We're such terrible people.
I know. What's with authors, honestly? Just torturing people. I'm sort of a side tangent, but I'm reading the Red Rising trilogy right now, and oh my gosh.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you want to talk about characters getting put through the ringer. I'm just like, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Oh my God, it's just
You're like,
terrible.
If I can't take it and I'm just reading about it, how are these characters taking it when they're living it?
It's like you really do. Like, there's a part of you that thinks they really do exist in some parallel universe.
Yeah.
And you're like, what kind of
so
awful
bad
person. Yeah, honestly, but I do it in my own writing. Every writer does and I keep reading the books about it, so clearly I'm part of the problem here.
We want to feel something, right? It's like,
Yeah,
let me feel
absolutely.
something.
But that's the whole point, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay, what's your favorite thing about Callan and Nova's relationship?
So one way that I specifically market my series, and I'm a big fan of marketing your series by talking about what it is versus like knocking what it's not. So this is not me knocking what it's not, but I specifically say that it's like the romance is green flag, and I sort of liken it to like Claire and Jamie Fraser in Outlander. And what I mean by that is, for me, I didn't like, I'm an anxious person. So I love reading stories where you're like, will they be together? And for my own anxiety, it's like, and for other people's too, maybe like, I like that Nova and Callan, they're going to be together. Like, there's not this question about like, do they really care about each other, anything. It's like, that is something, I think their connection and their wanting to be together is something that's very solid and set in stone. And what happens more is, will the world that they live in allow them to be together? You know, will circumstances keep them apart? But the wanting to be together and that like solid foundation that they have, I think, is one of my favorite things about their relationship. I already touched upon it, but I like how supportive and how much compassion they're able to extend to each other. They seem to be there for each other in difficult moments in like just the right way. I think they know each other well enough to show up for each other in the way that they need. And that's something that I continued to explore in the second book, because like I was just saying, like, you know, being in love or having a romantic relationship doesn't necessarily fix everything. So even in the second book, we're still dealing with people's, you know, knee-jerk reactions to things, and it's still challenging and it's still a struggle. But I love that they have that solid foundation and like the commitment to each other to show up in difficult moments for one another, which of course there are many, because we just keep testing them, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think more or less, I mean, you know, they're kind of at war. So, yeah, I mean, if there's any circumstance that's going to really put a relationship through the test, I sort of like, you know, you did have a little bit of, sure, I suppose you could call it the miscommunication going on there, but I would say more it's that the character just had walls that were up that kind of kept them from each other. But I agree, as a fellow anxious reader, it's nice to kind of have that security that, you know, it seems, I could be wrong because I've not read the second book, but it kind of seems like the conflict from this point out is going to be more external than internal between the two of them, which there's, you know, a certain level of stability in that, I guess, that I appreciate as a reader.
Yeah. I'm one of those people who, if there's like a third act breakup, even if I'm reading a romance and so I know like within like 60 pages they're going to be back together, it's like too much for me.
Yeah, I don't like it. No, I agree.
Everything's going to be okay in the end.
Yep. I'm totally with you on that. It seems like I get that way the older I get. Like I'm like more averse to things going wrong in my books. I'm like, where are my happy ending fairy tales that I can't handle this anymore? This is too hard.
Too much stress.
Yeah, exactly. I read to relax, okay? I don't need more stress. I've got plenty of that. It's fine.
I also do like that Nova and Callan do have like a friendship as the basis of their romance too. And like I said, the type of people that they are is, you know, I know a lot of people enjoy banter, and like Callan and Nova are just not really banter people. Like they don't really have that like witty banter with one another, but I think they do have a lot of moments where like there's like even if it's like very slight teasing, like they slightly tease each other, or, you know, I do think that there's a good foundation of friendship, and that was important to me too, because I think, you know, if you're going to be a fated mate with someone and so therefore be together for your very long life, you know, there should be that good foundation of friendship too.
Yeah, I think friendship, friends to lovers, is one of the most underutilized tropes, like in all of romance literature. We're in such a phase as, you know, like broad readership of wanting enemies to lovers, and I get it. I love enemies to lovers. I'm not here to knock that. I read it. It's great. But I think there's really something to be said for friends to lovers. It's just such a sweet, understated storyline that I would like to see more of that in.
Yeah, I agree.
What is the hardest scene you had to write, and why?
So for Sun, Moon, and Shadow, the scene that I always struggled with, and every time I went back to edit it, it was like I kind of dreaded it was the scene where, like, this is full of spoilers. This episode, I'll have to tell people, like,
Spoiler alert.
read the book first, and then you can go watch the podcast. But Nova meeting her mom, like, and that interaction, because there was just so much history to share, and so, like, as a writer, like, you know, just coming at it from like a, you know, a writing this point of view, I didn't want to overwhelm or like bore the reader with all these details of like, this happened long ago, you know, like I didn't want it to be an info dump in a way. I also kind of I went into it not really anticipating that Nova would be angry in that interaction, but then when I started writing it, she was angry, and I'm a mom, so I also kind of am like, well, cut your mom some slack here, you know. Got her own things going on, you know, and I've had readers flag that too, where they want to know, like, they want to know more about her mom and how her mom's doing and what's going to happen with her mom and all that stuff. But that scene, I always just really struggled working on, just because I worried that it wouldn't have the impact that like I wanted it to have. And I'm not sure why that scene, and maybe because there was a lot riding on that, I just worried that it wasn't coming out the way that I wanted it to. And so it was one of those things where, like, you, with certain things when you're writing, you just have to get it to a point where you're like, well, that's like, this is as good as I can get it, and I hope that, you know. And then when people started reading it, they were like shocked by the reveal. They were, you know, really invested in that interaction between them, and obviously also asking about, like, in the future, are they going to talk again? Like, is Nova going to patch up that relationship? But that was like a really challenging scene to work on as I wrote the book.
Yeah, I'm sure it's very heavy and just loaded with that backstory. And again, Nova's biggest insecurity is her abandonment issues.
Yeah, exactly.
So for me, it wasn't surprising that she had big opinions about it. It seemed to track very much with her character.
Yeah. And that's a funny thing too, is that you hear, because obviously this is my first book that I've written, but you hear authors talk about, especially people who are plotters, being like, this is going to happen, here's how it's going to go, and then they say, oh, and then the characters like took over, and I always used to be like, really? The characters took over? But I had several times while writing where it was like the characters went in like a direction that I didn't anticipate. Nova and Callan have an argument right before, like, the big thing, like the big thing that happens in the book, and they weren't originally going to have an argument, but then they did, and I think it actually was better for the story.
Yeah, as a plotter, you can tell me if you disagree with this, but I feel like everyone to an extent is still, what do they call it? I think they call it the gardener, where you just kind of like throw the seeds and see what grows. Yeah, pantser, exactly. You know, I think all books have an element of that, because in my experience, like, the character and the stories do take over. Like, they just do, even if you do plot everything out. Like, I'm definitely a pantser. I just sit down and write and see where it goes.
Yeah.
But I really respect plotters, because I can't do it.
I like having
there's always
like a general roadmap, obviously. So it's like, by this point, like, they're going to be here or something. But I've sat down to write several scenes, even in like the second book, where as I'm writing, something new and cool that I hadn't really thought about ends up happening, and that's very cool. So like, I like to have a general roadmap, but I definitely leave space for that exploratory writing where, you know, if something comes up and it's better than what you planned and it fits, and, you know, if you don't have to like readjust a million other little things to make it happen, if that's not something that you want to do, you can explore that.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for pantsers, because, you know, and I think especially if you're writing a series where, like, by the end, all of these threads have to come together and be resolved. You know, there's definitely loose threads hanging at the end of Sun, Moon, and Shadow that have to get resolved in the second book, and then, you know, things that will still carry into the third book. And for me, I like to have an idea of where those things are going. But I think also people are really creative too, so it's like, even if you get to the end and you hadn't planned for these things to tie together, people are so creative and so, you know, interesting that they can make these things fit and make these things work, even if it wasn't necessarily like the plan all along.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that I've been loving about this podcast, is getting just to talk with other writers and hear their processes. Talk shop, yeah, it's
fun.
It is. Yeah, it really, really is. So I know you're working on the second book.
Yes.
Are there any other projects or anything else you want to talk about, just put out there for any audience watching this podcast for them to know about?
Yeah, so the big thing that I'm working on is I'm writing the second book, which I've already released the title, which is called Death Will Follow, and I'm hoping to have that
I love it.
released in the fall if everything goes according to plan. And it's sort of one of the lessons I learned as an indie author putting out my first book was like we have our plan and then things happen, And so it's like I think I learned a lot the first time around, and so this time I'm like, oh yeah, everything's gonna go a lot smoother and stuff. So I still haven't released an actual official release date because I'm just that much of a, need to have everything buttoned up or whatever. But so Death Will Follow is hopefully coming this fall. That's the second book. It's with beta readers right now, and it's a really fun story. So I'm excited to share that with people.
Awesome. Okay, Death Will Fall. I am obsessed with that name. It definitely seems to align with you saying it's more spooky and a little bit darker. So that's exciting. And the last question I like to ask all of my guests is, what are some of your favorite books, your biggest inspirations as a writer? Who are the authors that just make you want to sit down and type at your keyboard, or some of the books that really inspired your book?
Yeah, so I have like varied reading tastes, and so I was thinking about this. The book that, even though I started reading more regularly over the pandemic, like I would say the series that kind of got me back into reading and therefore, moving my way back towards writing was Outlander. And that was quite a few years ago that I started reading that series. I am a fan of like historical romance and like,
oh, okay.
And so that sort of fit the bill there. And so it's really interesting that like some of my favorite authors, I love Tana French, who writes like procedural, like Irish police mystery procedurals.
Awesome.
Like, but she, obviously it's like, to write a mystery, you really do have to be, I guess there are mystery writers probably that are not plotters, but I think you have to be more focused on like getting from point A to point B and having red herrings and things like that. And so I really love reading stories like that. I'm also just a giant Allie Hazelwood fan. I love contemporary romance too. And so she's definitely my, like, if she writes it, I'll read it. But since becoming part of the indie author community, especially on Instagram, I'm like so inspired by the other indie authors on there. Some of them have become friends. Like some people, I've been like obsessed with their characters and waiting for their book to come out for like a year plus or something. You just get so invested along that journey. So I would say these days, a lot of what I read is actually other indie author books. And it's just everybody's creating such cool worlds, being able to do things that Trad Pub can't always do, and maybe someday we'll be better about doing. It seems like they're snapping up a lot of indie titles these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just really inspired by this community that I'm a part of. So
everybody go read Sun, Moon, and Shadow, and Death Will Follow. Read that, pick that up in the fall. It sounds awesome. And Lorin Coffler, thank you so much for being on Authors on Audio.
Thank you so much for having me.